Hey everyone. It was our weekly D&D session. Greta, Johnny, Zach, and I had been best friends on campus, but our jobs put us all over the country. This D&D campaign, meeting up every Saturday afternoon on a video call, made us all feel a little closer. It was the highlight of my week, but not this time, because about 15 minutes in, motion caught my eye. Behind Greta, out on the sidewalk, a man was walking by. People walked by all the time. Her apartment window faced a busy street, but this man looked different. He was wearing mostly black and walked with a strange limp as he made his way past her window. And something almost looked familiar about him. I clicked on Greta's image, maximizing her video feed, but he was too far away and the resolution was too low to see his face, and then he was gone. Weird. Allison, what did you roll? My attention snapped back to the game. Sorry, it was a 3. As Greta described an epic failure where my rogue's bow malfunctioned and hit her square in the face, I aimlessly stared at Zach's video feed. He looks good. We dated a few months, way back when, but things just didn't work out. Maybe they could work out now, but long distance, it would be very difficult. Besides, I wasn't really ready for a relationship right now. I was 6 months sober, trying to get my life on track, trying to forget the shit show that was senior year. And then another flash of motion caught my eye, behind Johnny. Johnny was sitting at the local Starbucks, loudly slurping a caramel macchiato through a straw. Behind him, people walked to and from. A mother with a crying little girl, 2 teenage boys shoving each other and laughing. But that wasn't what caught my eye. Beyond them, in the parking lot, was a tall man dressed in black. I clicked on Johnny's feed and leaned into the screen. Again, the resolution was too low to make out his face, but he seemed to be wearing the same bowler hat, the same long black jacket. Has to be a coincidence. Greta lived down in Oklahoma, hundreds of miles away from Johnny. Couldn't be the same guy. There was no way. Roll for damage, Allison. I grabbed the D20 off my deck. When I looked back at Johnny's screen, the man was gone. I shook my head. Just a coincidence. I sucked in a breath as the die clattered against the wood. 18, I said, looking back at the screen. Nice, Zach said sarcastically. My eyes snapped to his screen. He was sitting in his usual spot, on the moldy green couch in the living room. For a second, I imagined myself sitting next to him, snuggled up against his shoulder. His face was in shadow now, as sunlight streamed through the gazy curtains behind him, but I could still make out his bright blue eyes, the curves of his rugged jaw. Maybe I should take my chances. I know I had a lot of emotional baggage, a lot of things to work on, but maybe we could work on them together. Maybe. I froze. Movement from behind the curtains. A silhouette walking by. A silhouette with a limp. My blood ran cold. No, there's no way. The shadow passed, disappearing beyond the edge of the window. Guys? I started, my voice wavering. Did you see that? That guy with the bowler hat and the limp? Greta's eyebrows furrowed, and then she said something that froze every muscle in my body. You mean the guy that's standing right outside your window? I whipped around, then I ran over to the window. I thought I saw a flash of movement, a sweep of black, but only for an instant. Or was it in my imagination? The grass rippled in the wind and the pine trees swayed, but the sidewalk and the street were empty. I saw him in each of your videos, I stuttered. Wearing all black, right? With the hat and the long jacket and the... I only saw him in your video, Greta replied. You're saying you saw the guy in our videos? I nodded. But the confused mutters from the other players told me they hadn't seen him. Only Greta had seen him walking by, behind me. I bit my lip, my hands frozen on the keyboard. Weird coincidence, Zach said finally. But a lot of people wear black coats, and a lot of bald guys wear hats. But he was limping too. Glitch in the Matrix kind of thing then, Zach replied, shrugging. I don't know, can we resume playing though? Greta started up again and I leaned back in my chair, sighing. I tried to forget about the man, though, and put all my focus on the game. For almost an hour everything went fine, and then I saw it. At the very edge of Greta's screen, just barely poking out from behind the window frame, was the man. All I could see was his sleeve, half of one of his legs, and a shiny black shoe. How long has he been standing there? Greta, he's right outside your window, I nearly shouted. Greta paused for a second, then she got up, went over to the window and peered out. I don't see anyone, she said finally, sitting back down. But the instant she sat back down, he stepped out into frame. He limped out into view, onto the sidewalk. I still couldn't see his face, but I could tell that his head was turned, as if he were looking into Greta's window. He made his way down the sidewalk and disappeared, and then stepped into Johnny's video. His stride didn't even break. It was like he had just seemingly walked from one video feed to the next. He walked down the sidewalk outside the Starbucks, his head still turned, as if staring in at Johnny, and then his shadow appeared behind the gazy curtains at Zach's. He appeared to slow down like he was taking his time, staring in at Zach through the translucent curtains. His halting, limping steps jerked his whole body as he made his way across. Then he walked out of view, and I knew it was my turn. I jumped out of my chair and ran to the window. Half of me expected to see nothing, just an empty street and sidewalk. But no, it wasn't empty. In the darkening dust, I could see the man standing on the other side of the street, eyes hidden in the shadows beneath his bowler hat. My blood turned to ice. I stood there, frozen at the window. We stared at each other for a few seconds, and then he lifted his hand and curled his index finger, beckoning me. I backed away from the window, my legs trembled beneath me. There was no way this could even happen. Whoever that man was, he wasn't real, because there's no way he could instantly be in Oklahoma, then Ohio, then New York. My legs hit the chair. I turned around, away from the window, back to my friends. Except they weren't there. Each video feed was malfunctioning. A jumble of pixelated shapes, lagging and jumping and twisting together. Greta? Johnny? Zach? I shouted. Only a distorted series of clicks answered me. I turned back to the window. The man was closer now, standing in the middle of the street. I wrenched the window open. "Hey, get out of here," I shouted, trying to hide my fear in my voice. "I'm calling the cops." I ran around the house, making sure every door was locked, and then I went up to my room and locked the door, hid myself in the blankets, and began to sob. But I didn't call the cops, because I finally knew why he looked familiar. Senior year, the party, the four of us piling in the car, my car. "I feel fine," I'd said, waving off any concerns about driving drunk. But I was drunk, just not total blackout drunk like the other three. I was the only one who'd seen the man walk out into the crosswalk. The tall man dressed in black, which camouflaged him in the night, but I didn't see him soon enough. The brakes screeched underneath me, but it was too late. A sickening thump. The bowler hat went flying off into the darkness. What was that? Greta slurred from the back seat as Zach puked and Johnny drifted in and out of sleep. Nothing, I'd replied before gunning it and tearing it out onto the highway. I pulled the blankets tighter around me and pray for him to leave. But even now I can hear something above me, coming from the attic. The footsteps of a limping man. I'm not sure I'll survive the night. I'm writing this so at least somebody knows what happened. And if I don't make it, I'm sorry. My daughter Kennedy is 13 years old, but she thinks like a wise grandma. She never causes any trouble and knows what's best for herself. She never needed help with anything, and she only relied on herself. It started to get really bad when she turned 10. Me and my wife, Lauren, thought it was cute when she wanted to do everything on her own, but it got out of hand when she would totally break down if we tried to help her. She never asked us for any help with school, never asked my wife for advice for boys like most preteens would. We got so worried when she stopped eating and lost 10 pounds because of how focused she was on school. Kennedy was our first kid at the time, so we had to ask around on how we can help her. The local parents had some basic ideas like going on vacation or having a family game night every Friday. Me and my wife had already thought of these things, but they never worked out in the end. Kennedy always found a way to think of school and work. We kept on asking the parents when one couple said, "Take her on a camping trip." Me and Lauren really thought about this idea. It would be a secluded cabin by a nice lake. It would be a perfect opportunity to have some family time without anything in our way. Little did we know that would be the worst mistake of our lives. So, on June 28th, 2013, at 9:45 a.m., we left for the cabin. Lauren's parents used to camp all the time before they died, so they left the cabin for her. Lauren was excited because she hadn't been there since she was 17. I remember the whole way there. It's hard to forget a day like that. The weather was great, the sky was blue, the wind was just right. We had a little party in the car, but of course Kennedy didn't want to join in. When we got closer to the cabin, the smooth road became gravel. When we got there, Kennedy immediately got out of the car and ran down to the lake. It was weird because Kennedy hated lakes because of how they were infested with bacteria and diseases. Me and Lauren unpacked the car while Kennedy sat down in front of the lake. "This is going a lot better than we planned," Lauren said, placing down her suitcase in the cabin. "I know, I think this was a good idea," I said as I was placing down the last of the bags. Lauren brought her stuff upstairs to our room while I took a look around. I've never been to this cabin before, so all of this was new to me. After an hour or two, Kennedy still didn't come inside. Me and Lauren didn't bother to bring her in because she looked like she really liked the outside, but it was getting dark, so I went outside while Lauren was cooking some hamburgers. "Kennedy," I yelled a little. "Dinner's almost ready, so come back inside." No answer. "Kennedy?" I yell a little louder than last time. "Boo!" Kennedy comes up from behind me and scares the living shit out of me. "Oh my gosh, Kennedy, don't scare me like that." I'm holding my heart through my shirt. Kennedy grins and walks inside. Kennedy was way more mature than this, but I brushed it off because maybe she felt more at ease out here. We had our hamburgers and went upstairs to go sleep. Kennedy was much happier and energetic, which is the total opposite from when she is at home. At home, Kennedy is sad and gloomy and so tired. When Lauren finished brushing her teeth, I told her what happened when I was calling in Kennedy from outside. And of course she just said it's because the change of the scenery, but I had a bad feeling in my gut, but was too tired to think much of it, so I fell asleep. I was first up, so I decided to make breakfast for a change. I finished cooking some pancakes and went upstairs to wake up the girls. I went into mine and Lauren's room, and she was sleeping so peacefully. I gently shook her to wake up. "Rise and shine, breakfast is ready." Lauren smiled a bit and got up. I was on my way to Kennedy's room when a wave of rotten stench took over. I almost threw up on the spot, but I had to swallow it back. I slowly walked up to Kennedy's door and opened it. Her window was open and there was a dead deer laying on its side beside her bed. The deer was in shreds. The inside was on the outside, its eyeballs were nowhere to be seen, and there were bugs all inside and out. I looked around and Kennedy was gone. I yelled for Lauren, telling her that Kennedy is missing. Lauren ran to Kennedy's room and held back a mouthful of vomit. She ran back to our room and quickly called 911. It took them 25 minutes to get to the cabin because we were literally in the middle of nowhere. They searched around the cabin and a little in the woods but found nothing but a piece of clothing that Kennedy had on. We had to leave our things back at the cabin so that the detectives could do a search. Me and Lauren got asked questions like, "What were you doing when she went missing?" and stuff like, "Did she act different beforehand?" You know, like the ones on TV. We soon got released and went back home. Lauren fell ill a couple days after the disappearance, so I had to take more days off of work to take care of her. Lauren didn't eat and had many nightmares about Kennedy and the dead deer in her room. I got her into therapy 2 weeks after Kennedy went missing. I was worried about Lauren and the things that she could do to herself. Lauren was progressively getting better after every session, so she started eating more as a result. We were having chicken Alfredo that night when we got a knock on the door. It was a soft knock that could have been mistaken for the wind. At first, that's what we thought, so we continued eating until the soft knock turned into a bang. We both jumped and stared at the door for a good minute, then I got up to check the door. I opened the door slowly, and then I saw her. Kennedy standing on the front steps. She smelled disgusting and looked like she'd been to hell and back. I quickly let her inside and Lauren ran to her while sobbing on Kennedy's shoulder while squeezing her in a tight hug. I quickly called the ambulance and gave her a tight hug despite her smelling like a dead animal. When we got to the hospital, there were doctors outside already waiting for her with a stretcher. Kennedy was rushed inside while me and Lauren waited in the waiting room. It took about 25 minutes before a nurse came out and let us into her room. She didn't say anything while we were there, even when the police came in and questioned her. She was silent. She was allowed out the next day because her cuts weren't that bad. On the way home, I took a quick peek at the rearview mirror to check up on her and found her already looking at me. No emotion in her eyes. I got startled and quickly looked away. When we got home, she immediately went up to her room and slammed the door so loud it made me jump. Me and Lauren were worried when she didn't come down for dinner. It was finally time for bed when I heard a thump come from her room. Me and Lauren rushed to her room and was shocked by what we saw. A tall, dark man holding a dead deer over his shoulder. I quickly turned around looking for the light switch. When I looked back, the man was gone, and only left was the deer. It looked identical from the deer at the cabin. Kennedy was wide awake with the same cold expression on her face. I doubted for a bit that she saw anything because of her reaction, but Lauren swore she saw Kennedy awake during everything. She also said she saw a small smirk on her face. Of course I didn't believe her because she could have easily just seen it wrong, and it was pretty dark, so I didn't pay attention to that. I ran up to Kennedy, but she didn't even look at me. She was staring at the deer with the slightest bit of excitement in her eyes. I told Lauren to call the police and fill them in on what we saw while I took Kennedy outside. The house reeked of dead animal and I couldn't handle it. Even though I've smelled the stench multiple times, it's just something you just can't get used to. Kennedy fell asleep on my shoulder while waiting for the police to arrive. They did a deep search in the house but came up with nothing. Me and Lauren packed up some things for us and Kennedy and went to a hotel for the night. It would take a while for that smell to leave the house. When we got there, Kennedy was still passed out, so I had to do 2 trips. After dropping off Kennedy in our hotel room, I went back down to get the leftover things in the car. I could see my car from the inside the hotel, and then I saw him again. The same tall black figure that was in Kennedy's room the same night. I rubbed my eyes thinking I must have been seeing things because of how exhausted I was, but he was still right there, right beside my car looking at me. I felt shivers down my spine and had a bad feeling in my gut. I should have never walked up to that man, but I was too stubborn to let him walk free. I stomped outside and faced him. Well, sort of. This man was a lot taller than I thought, and I'm a pretty tall man myself. I'm around 6'1", and this man was way taller than me. You could have mistaken him for Slender Man if he wasn't so dark and didn't look so humanly. I looked up at him and he slowly looked down. "Who are you?" I yelled at him with frustration in my voice. "Why won't you leave my Kennedy alone?" I was huffing at this point, and then he moved. He bent down a little bit and he started to put his hand over my face. I tried so hard to get out of his grip, but nothing worked, and then I passed out. I woke up in the hotel room with Lauren sleeping on the other end of the bed. I quickly get up, looking around frantically, expecting to see the man again, but he was gone. Lauren woke up because of how hard I was breathing and comforted me, telling me it was just a bad dream, but I swear it wasn't. Ever since that day, I swear I've been seeing this man everywhere I go. I've seen him at work, at the end of my bed, around the corners of my house, even when I'm out in public. But the place I see him most is in Kennedy's room. I don't know if I'm crazy or not, but I swear she can see him too. Whenever I see this man somewhat close to her, she's automatically in a great mood. She gets talkative, she hangs out with us, she even cooks us dinner once in a while. But when this man leaves, she almost immediately loses all motivation to continue what she was doing. When he's not around, she gets violent. I don't mean like saying mean things, I mean like full on punching me or slapping Lauren for no particular reason. Lauren can't bring herself to be hard on Kennedy ever since the incident, but I'm as hard on her as I was before. I ground her and take her phone. Nothing big. One night the man was around, so Kennedy was all happy and cooking us dinner. Me and Lauren were watching a show, but when I looked back, the man was crouched down to Kennedy's height, whispering something in her ear. Kennedy chuckled a bit and then walked away, but the man didn't follow her, he just stood there, looking at me. I jumped off the couch, scaring Lauren. I ran over to him. "Leave my family alone," I said, making sure to keep my voice down so I don't worry Lauren. The man laughs a wicked, weird laugh. It hurt my ears so much I had to cover them with my hands. Kennedy came back with something in her hand, a dead rat. She looked surprised when she saw me, quickly hiding the rat behind her back. I looked back at the man, but he was gone, disappeared out of thin air. Lauren was sitting on the couch, looking at us in confusion. I grabbed Kennedy's hand and showed the dead rat to Lauren. "We need to call someone about this," I say, no hesitation in my voice whatsoever. Lauren looked disgusted and almost threw up. I got Kennedy to throw the rat outside and then go upstairs and pack her stuff. I didn't know what I was going to do at that moment, but I knew I didn't want this thing in my house anymore. It may seem mean of me to call my daughter a thing, but if you were in my position, then you would say it too. Kennedy finished packing and we got into the car. We drove around for 45 minutes so that I could find out what to do with her. And then I thought of it. The perfect place for someone like her would be a mental hospital or something. I didn't know a lot about mental illnesses, but I was sure that Kennedy had one. We did everything we needed to and left her there. A big weight lifted off my back after we got in the car. I felt a little guilty for doing that, but what else could I have done? It was my first time dealing with something like that, and no one would understand if I told them. That night I had the worst nightmare about Kennedy and the man, and I can't bring myself to say it. It still disgusts me to this day. I swear I've been seeing Kennedy in her room just standing there. When I rub my eyes, she's gone. I can't explain the things I'm seeing to anybody, but I'm sure you guys will understand. This isn't my story, but it's apparently true. Scariest story I've ever heard. You can find it if you type in Savernake Forest in Mumsnet. Warning, it's a very long story and very freaky, and if anyone can come up with a rational explanation, I'd be extremely grateful because I'm generally a pretty rational, non-woo, where's the evidence type person. But I've never been able to explain this, and it still makes my heart beat faster and the hair stand up on my arms when I think about it years later. I was pet sitting for my friend several years ago. She had moved into sort of a small holding right on the edge of a village in the southwest, with a huge garden that backed onto the trees. At the time she had a right menagerie, chickens, ducks, a couple of Shetlands, cats, and 4 black retrievers, 3 fully grown and 1.5 grown puppy. Originally DH had been going to come with me as a little holiday, but the dates she ended up having to go away for work clashed with a couple of his medical appointments. So we stayed home with our dog and I went to pet sit alone. It was about halfway through my stay a couple of nights ago, late evening, already dark, when I heard a massive commotion from the chicken shed, banging and thumping. I assumed a fox or something had got in, so I went out to check. As I was halfway across the garden, the noise stopped instantly, as if it had been shut off. By the time I got to the shed, all was calm, and the chickens were all settled, mostly asleep. No sign of any intruder or disturbance at all. Nothing to explain the noise or any indication that the chickens had made a noise. Bit freaky, but I didn't, and still don't, know much about the way of the chicken, so I locked up again and left them to it. As I went back in the house, a small black shape ran past me out of the back door, and I realized the puppy must have got out. It streaked across the garden and off towards the woods. Cue much cursing and then calling her name in vain. More cursing when she didn't come back. I grabbed a torch and put one of the other dogs on the lead, partly for protection, partly because I thought the pup was more likely to come back if I had one of her canine companions with me, and partly because I didn't fancy my chances of finding my way back to the house on my own, even though there were a couple vague paths that I'd followed when walking the dogs throughout the week. Off we trudged into the wood along these paths, me calling Pup's name at intervals and trying not to imagine murderers and rapists behind every tree trunk. We got to a point where it felt like the trees were starting to thin out, and I remember thinking that I didn't remember a clearing on this path. We must have gone wrong somewhere when the dog with me slowed right down and started to resist going forward. I tried to jolly her along, while my stomach suddenly dropped like a stone, and she started growling. A really low, serious rumbling growl. By this time I was practically shitting myself. I tried shining the torch ahead, but the beam just sort of bounced back off the darkness, if that made sense. I got the sense of something, or some things, moving, but just sinuous, deeper black shapes against the blackness and always on the periphery of vision. The hairs on my arms are standing up again, just remembering how completely and utterly terrified I was. I've honestly never known a feeling like it. At this point the dog sank right back down, still growling, hackles up and refused to budge. I muttered something like, "Jesus, you've got to be kidding me," and this ugly, gurgling, inhuman sort of voice hissed, right up close as if someone was right next to me.
"Don't say that name."
At the same time there was a horrible snickering sort of laugh. I can't express how utterly petrified I was. I can't remember having any coherent thoughts apart from the word evil. That's the only clear thing I can remember. Me and the dog were frozen to the spot with pure fear. Then a different voice, really commanding, said, "Go back." That sounded more in my head, but echoey, where the others had sounded out in the thin air, if you know what I'm saying. Wherever it came from did the trick. Me and the dog turned and belted back through the woods. She basically towed me. I just clung onto her lead, stumbling to keep up and sobbing with fear. I lost the torch somewhere on that wild run, but there was no way I was stopping to find it. How I didn't run blindly into a tree I'll never know. She guided me, I guess. I can remember thinking desperately that I mustn't let go of her lead, or they would get me. When we got back to the garden, she suddenly stopped. I did fall over her this time, onto my hands and knees, turned around and started snarling, proper teeth bared, rabid-looking snarls, back at the trees and the darkness. I thought I heard the snickering again, but the blood was pounding in my ears so hard I can't be sure. I I scrambled up and ran to the back door, and she followed me, but backing and snarling all the way as if holding something at bay. Oh, and the chicken shed was banging and thumping again. I got the back door open, me and her belted in. I slammed home every bolt behind us. The other dogs left behind were staring at the door and growling too, with their hackles up, when I saw all three of them, puppy included. Acting like that, I started to cry properly because I honestly thought I was trapped in some horror film nightmare and was going to die. I don't know, I still don't know, what that black shape was that ran past me out of the house and triggered all this because the puppy was right there in the kitchen. Anyway, I made sure every door and window was locked and bolted. I turned on every light in the house. I wandered around mumbling all sorts of weird, half-religious, half-spiritual shit to ward off evil spirits. Gradually, the dogs settled down and stopped growling, and eventually stopped glancing at the door. Funnily enough, I didn't sleep for 1 second that night and rang my DH and begged him to come over the last couple of days. I know I didn't dream it because I was covered in scratches from running through the woods and had grazed hands from where I fell over the dog in the garden. Nothing like that has happened before or since, and I hope it never does. It was the single most terrifying experience of my entire life. Not a published story, but this happened to me late 2019 and is still better than any story I've ever read. I was homeless and living at a shelter, and the shelter is on the campus of a defunct state mental hospital. The buildings are all interconnected by a subterranean tunnel system, which is closed off due to a combo of being structurally compromised and documented paranormal occult activity. I was washing dishes in the kitchen late one night because doing extra shelter chores earned you bonus perks like bus tokens, gift cards for places like Walmart, Target, and the like, or even nights off site that weren't for anything work, medical, legal, or family emergency related. Anywho, the kitchen is in the shelter basement and adjacent to the tunnel system. Unbeknownst to me, no one, staff and residents alike, liked being in the basement alone at night. I knew the history of the hospital, but not of the shelter itself. So I'm hand washing, and this is crucial, dishes all by my lonesome. Wasn't the first time, but was most definitely my last. It was late in the year, but still warm out so that the heat wasn't on yet. All of the kitchen appliances were off, dishwasher included. Out of nowhere, the whole kitchen heats up by like 15 to 20 degrees, and I get this massively heavy feeling like trying to move through a wet cement, as well as the feeling of something watching me that did not want me there, to the point of me being unable to breathe. It's also worth noting that I was a shelter goofball and always made people laugh, so nobody ever had an issue with me, staff included. Needless to say, I was a model resident, so this wasn't someone with a personal grudge trying to freak me out. Suddenly, I both hear and feel this booming, resounding, deep voice that says a single word.
Run.
Obviously, I book it out of there and sprint up the stairs, and immediately, when I left the hallway, where the kitchen and the tunnel system were, it cooled off back to normal. The heavy feeling went away instantly, and I could breathe again. The overnight employee at the front desk looks at me, raises an eyebrow as I sit there gasping for air, and asks if I'm good. I ask her what people's paranormal experiences have been at the shelter, and not describing my own because I just wanted a confirmation that I wasn't insane before spilling my guts to this caseworker who I barely knew. She described verbatim exactly what I'd just been through and ended it with a, "And that's why no one likes to wash dishes alone down there at night, employees included." I've always been the kind of person who tries to explain away the unexplainable. I am a nurse after all. I've seen more than my fair share of patients slipping away in the strange, sometimes eerie moments that accompany death. But what happened to me one night in the hospital was something I still can't quite explain. It was late, well past midnight, and the hospital was unnervingly quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you hyper aware of every creak and distant murmur. I was on the night shift in the old wing of the hospital, which had been around since the early 1900s. Most of the patients were asleep. I was doing my rounds, checking vitals and making sure everyone was comfortable. When I reached room 314, I noticed something off. The door was slightly ajar and a soft, unsettling light spilled into the hallway. It wasn't the sterile, cold light of the fluorescent bulbs, but a warm, almost inviting glow. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was empty except for an old armchair in the corner and the faintest trace of lavender in the air. I'm talking about the kind of lavender scent that you'd expect from a grandmother's old perfume, not the antiseptic smell that fills most of the hospital. I shrugged it off as a leftover from a patient's belongings and moved to check the chart at the foot of the bed. And that's when I saw her. At first, I thought it was just my tired eyes playing tricks on me. An elderly woman, dressed in an old-fashioned nightgown, was sitting in the armchair. Her face was obscured by low light, but I could make out her silver hair and the outline of her frail hands resting in her lap. I froze. It wasn't visiting hours, and I didn't recognize her from any of the patients. "Excuse me, ma'am," I said gently, trying not to startle her. "Are you lost? This is a patient's room." She looked up slowly, her eyes met mine. They were hollow, almost as if there were no life behind them, yet they seemed to pierce through me with an unbearable sadness. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. And just then, the room temperature dropped sharply, and I could see my breath clouding in front of me. I took a step back, feeling a shiver run down my spine. "I need to get a nurse or a doctor," I said, my voice trembling. As I turned to leave, I glanced back over my shoulder, and the woman was gone, and the armchair was empty. The light was gone too, replaced by the harsh glare of the fluorescent bulbs. I went to check the chart again, hoping it would explain everything. The chart was gone, and there was no record of any patient ever being in room 314. Confused, I asked around, but no one knew anything about a patient in that room. I even looked through the hospital records, but everything came up blank. The room was listed as unoccupied and had been for months. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept thinking about those hollow eyes and the strange, comforting scent of lavender. To this day, I can't explain what I saw or who that woman was. All I know is that room 314 has been empty since then, and every time I pass by, I can't shake the feeling of something or someone still lingers there. Sometimes when the hospital is quiet, I swear I can catch a whiff of lavender in the air. It always sends a shiver down my spine, reminding me of that cold, eerie night. Maybe some spirits can't leave until they've found peace, or maybe they're just wandering, looking for something that's been lost for a long time. Either way, room 314 is a place I avoid whenever possible. I've driven a cab in New York City for over 15 years. You see all sorts of things in this job: drunk college kids, late night fare hoppers, and the occasional street performer or vagrant. But what happened to me one night was unlike anything I'd ever encountered. It was a cold, rainy night in November, and the city was shrouded in a thick fog that seemed to swallow up the streetlights. Business was slow when I was cruising down the nearly deserted streets, hoping to pick up a fare before calling it a night. That's when I saw him, a figure standing alone on a corner barely illuminated by the dim streetlight. He was a tall man in a dark overcoat, his face hidden under a wide-brimmed hat. I slowed down and rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" He nodded, and I unlocked the door. He climbed in, and as he settled into the back seat, I noticed something strange. He didn't say a word, just a heavy, unsettling silence as he stared out the window. "Where to?" I asked, glancing at him through the rearview mirror. He didn't respond. The only sound in the cab was a rhythmic patter of the rain against the windows. I tried to make small talk, but he remained silent, his presence growing increasingly eerie. We drove in the silence through the fog, and I started to feel uneasy. It was as if the air in the cab had thickened, pressing down on me with an almost tangible weight. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke, his voice soft, almost a whisper, but it carried an unsettling edge. "Stop here." I pulled over at the edge of an old abandoned building, the kind of place that looked like it hadn't seen a lick of paint or passerby in decades. I glanced back at him through the rearview mirror, but his hat still obscured his face. "Are you sure this is where you want to go?" I asked. I'd never seen anyone get out here, especially this late at night. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat and handed me a wad of cash, more than enough to cover the fare. I took it, but my fingers brushed against it, something cold and clammy, and I looked down and saw that the cash was damp, almost as if it had been submerged in water. "Thanks," I said, trying to mask my growing discomfort. "You have a good night." He stepped out of the cab, his movements slow and deliberate. As he walked away, I watched him disappear into the fog, his figure slowly swallowed up by the darkness. I was about to drive off when I noticed something strange in the back seat, an old-fashioned pocket watch lying on the seat. It was ornate with intricate engravings, and the glass face was cracked. I picked it up, and as I did, I felt a sudden, inexplicable chill. The watch was cold to the touch, colder than anything I'd ever felt before. I turned to look at the building where the man had gone, but it was completely silent now, as though it had never been disturbed. I didn't know what to do with the watch, so I tucked it into my glove compartment and decided to call it a night. That's when the dream started. Each night I'd find myself standing in that same foggy street corner, the same abandoned building looming in the distance. The man would be there, waiting, his face still hidden, but his presence unmistakably menacing. I tried to run, but my legs would feel like lead and the fog would close in, thickening around me until I couldn't breathe. I never saw the man again, but the watch stayed in my glove compartment. I tried to get rid of it, but no matter how many times I threw it away, it always ended up back in the cab. The dreams grew worse and the fog seemed to follow me, haunting my nights with its oppressive chill. Now, every time I pick up a fare on a foggy night, I can't help but feel a sense of dread. The city's noise seems to fade, replaced by the whisper of that cold, eerie presence. I keep hoping that one day I'll be able to rid myself of that cursed pocket watch, but until then, I'm trapped in a cycle of fear and unease, forever haunted by the man who never said a word. And every foggy night, when the city falls silent, I can't help but feel that I'm not alone, waiting for the man in the dark overcoat to return. In 2017, my roommate was busted for drug paraphernalia. To make matters worse, the bust happened on the landlord's property, so even though no charges were placed on me, I was evicted. Money was already tight, so without my roommate's contribution to rent, I would have had to move out anyway. But now I only had 3 days to find a place to stay. Living in a rural area, my options were limited. There was only one other small apartment complex and their rates were twice as high. However, I did find a newly listed rental only 5 miles away. It looked like an old barn that had been renovated and turned into a vertical duplex. The listing said both floors were vacant, but only showed pictures of the bottom floor. It was shabby, but I had no room to complain. I called the owner, a sweet-sounding old man with a thick southern drawl, and reserved the bottom floor. The next day I collected the few possessions I had and drove over to the farmstead. The old man was waiting for me at the main house. He looked like what I had imagined: dirty jeans, old boots, a big belly, and a long gray beard that matched his cotton shirt. I parked and headed over to greet him. "Howdy," he nodded at me as I walked over to him. "Hello," I answered. forcing any ounce of charisma I could muster into my tone. "I'm Melissa. Your property is beautiful." He extended his hand. "Eli, and thank you." I dropped my bags to welcome his handshake. "She's not what she used to be, but she's home." He knelt to grab my bags. "Oh, you don't need to do that. It's not that much," I told him, but he shook his head and picked them up anyway. "Where you're staying is around back," he said as he started to walk that way. "Sorry, but I don't have a driveway over to it yet. You're welcome to drive around and park in the grass if you like." There was no way my beater could drive through the tall grass. "That's alright, I don't mind walking." The duplex was less than 50 yards away from the main house, and there was a worn path through the tall grass to get there. It was vertically symmetrical, with the windows in the same places for the first and second floor. The second floor window looked to not have any glass. It looked smaller than in the photos, but I was looking forward to the serenity of nighttime on a farm. He unlocked the front door and flipped the lights on. It smelled of hay, manure, and wood, something I would have to get used to. To my right, there was an old tube TV on a cabinet with a dusty recliner pointed at it. Behind that was the bathroom, and behind that was the bedroom. The kitchen was along the back wall. To my left was a ladder leading right up to a hatch in the ceiling. "What's that?" I asked Eli, pointing to the ladder. "That's the way upstairs for now. I'll be adding a door and steps upstairs to the back of the place eventually, just haven't gotten around to it." He dropped my bags in the center of the room. "Don't worry, no one else is living here yet, and I don't plan on renting the upstairs out until I've finished the other entrance." "That's okay," I said as I continued to look around the space. "Did you just turn this into a living space recently?" "Oh no," he answered. "My granddad turned this place from a barn into a house many years ago for some distant cousins. Twins apparently. I didn't know any of them very well, I just inherited this place a couple years ago." "Oh, I'm sorry for your loss," I said, but he shook his head. I wasn't very close to my folks after 18, he huffed. "I wasn't much into farming, but as I've gotten older, the more appealing it's been. My parents worked tirelessly to try and keep this farm as big and profitable as my granddad did, but they struggled. Since I'd made a small farm on my own, I thought when I inherited this place that I could make it work, but I've struggled just like they did. That's why I'm renting out the place," he said as he shrugged. "I'm sure running a farm is incredibly difficult, especially by yourself." "Well," he paused, and he looked around the room a bit before continuing. "It wouldn't be so bad if it weren't for something messing with my crops and killing livestock." "Oh." He looked at me. "Now I don't mean to scare you. I'm sure it's just a few coyotes, and the livestock are all the way past the house on the other side." His attempt to comfort me was appreciated, but I was starting to feel like this was a mistake. I would stay there for as long as I had to, but I'd continue looking elsewhere. I guess that was the positive of renting from this man, as there was no contract and I just paid every month. "I'm sure it's fine," I said, trying to match his affirmation. "I don't have much of any livestock anymore, just a couple cattle and a few chicks, so I don't think it should be much of an issue." He handed me the key and stepped out the front door. "If you need anything, just call me or come knocking. Don't be shy." "Thank you very much," I told him as he walked back to his house. I walked around the space a bit before unpacking my bags and accustoming myself to a new home. That evening, I sat in the recliner and browsed on my phone for other places to stay. I looked for hours, expanding the boundary further and further away, but couldn't find anything I could afford. I even contemplated posting online for roommates, but after getting evicted due to the last one and the thought of living with a stranger, I would just as rather risk being eaten by coyotes. It had gotten late, and I could already start to smell the dew on the grass outside. When I got up to go to bed, the floor creaked loudly with every step. It sounded like the entire house groaned for every move I made. I didn't remember the house being this noisy earlier, but perhaps the silence of the evening made it that much more noticeable. I made my way to bed, but hardly slept. The next morning, as I walked back to my car, I saw Eli carrying a shovel over to the barn. I waved to him, but he must not have seen me. He disappeared inside and I left for work. When I returned that evening, Eli was sitting on the porch smoking. He nodded to me as I got out of my car. "Hello," I called over to him. I could tell he had just as long day as I did. "Long day?" "Same as always," he said and smiled. "Does misery love company?" I laughed. "Indeed it does," I answered. I walked over to him and we talked for an hour or so about our lives, growing up, and how we got to where we are. He was sweet and genuine, listening intently and sharing his own stories. It was exactly what we needed. "So am I the first person to stay here?" I asked. "Actually, I had one other lady stay here before you. She was probably about your age. She didn't stay very long though. We had a bit of an argument early on." "What happened?" I asked. "Well, she had rented out the bottom floor, but she let her sister stay on the top floor without talking with me first," he sighed. "I should have just let it go since I'm still not ready to rent that top floor out, but it just seemed poor manners. I brought it up to her kindly at first and she just kept denying it, but I would see them both standing at the windows together, one in the bottom and one in the top window, staring at me. I saw them several times over the course of a couple weeks doing that. They were odd ones." "That's definitely rude," I replied. "I don't blame you." He smiled at me. "Well, it's late. It's about time we go to bed." He got up and headed inside. "Good night," he called out as he closed the door behind him. "Good night," I answered as I walked around the house and back to the duplex. As I stepped inside, I noticed the loud creaking again. With each step, a squeak echoed around the house. It took me walking to the bedroom to notice that each creak under my feet sounded again right above me. I rocked back and forth to make sure I was hearing it right, and with each shift, a thud echoed upstairs. Was someone up there, I wondered? "Hello?" I called out, but no one answered. Was the sister still living up there? I tiptoed over to the ladder, each squeak upstairs matching my steps. No, it must be just something with how this place was constructed, I assured myself. I stared up at the hatch, contemplating taking a peek. Maybe it's best I wait until morning. I sat in the recliner that night, staring at the ladder. I may have dozed off a time or two, but it was another night of poor sleep. I didn't see Eli in the morning, or I would have asked him to investigate the second floor for me. I went off to work and left early to check out the second floor before it got too dark. When I came back, Eli was back near the barn with a shovel, covered in dirt and sweat. I waved at him again, but he didn't see me. When I got to the duplex, I stepped around a few times to see if the creaks were echoing upstairs, but they weren't anymore. I turned on my phone's flashlight and climbed the ladder. I found the light switch and flicked it on. The second floor was identical to the first floor. Everything was exactly the same except for the missing window pane in the front of the house, adjacent to the ladder. I crept over to the kitchen to see if there was anything to cover the window with, but all my drawers were empty. Then I noticed the bedroom door was closed. I tried to open it, but the door was locked. "Hello?" I called out as I knocked on the bedroom door, but there was no response. If someone had been living on the second floor, they didn't have any belongings. The only way out that I wouldn't notice would be the open window, but there would be no way back in without a ladder. They might have been sneaking in and out midday while I was at work, but surely Eli would have seen an intruder. I went back downstairs to find something to cover the window with. Despite how late it was, I decided to call Eli to ask him about the upstairs bedroom. I found a spare sheet under the bed as Eli picked up. "Hello?" Hey Eli, it's Melissa. I'm sorry to bother you so late, but I was checking out the second floor and noticed the bedroom door up there is locked. Is there a reason? He grumbled a bit to make it more obvious that I'd woken him up. Huh? There's no lock on the bedroom doors. I froze for a minute, then pressed one foot down. The creak echoed upstairs just like the night before. I took another step and it echoed again. Good night, Eli said as he hung up the phone. I froze. The only sound I could hear was the crickets outside. I dropped the sheet and sprinted towards the kitchen. The thuds and creaks I made were equally matched above. I grabbed a knife from the drawer and ran to the ladder. Again, every thump matched me in step. I climbed up and put my hand on the trap door, pausing for a moment to prepare myself before bursting through. There was no one. I rocked back and forth, listening to the creaks coming from below my feet and above my head. Then I stomped a couple of times and it echoed loudly, but it still sounded like it was coming from above. It must just be how this place is constructed, how the sound bounces around or how the frame moves, I told myself. But then I noticed the bedroom door was open. I took a couple of steps towards the bedroom and peered inside. Strange, but I was relieved. I guess the door opened when I was stomping around. My phone rang, and it was Eli. Hello? I answered. What are you doing? He asked. I was just looking around upstairs. There were some noises and the bedroom door opened, but he cut me off. No, he said. Why are you on the roof? What? I replied. What are you doing on the roof? Why were you stomping on it? I froze again. My mind raced. I stared at the open window above the ladder. Are you in your room? I asked. I couldn't see the house through the window at the angle I was at, so he shouldn't have been able to see me. Of course, I was in bed, he answered. I raised my hand and waved. Yes, hello, Eli said. I see you. I dropped my knife and jumped down the hatch. I grabbed my keys, got in my car, and never went back. I left the few things I had behind. Eli called me the next day and insisted I answer him as to why I was on the roof. I tried explaining that it wasn't me, that someone or something else lived there, but he wouldn't listen. Before we got off the phone, he asked me why there were blood and feathers in the upstairs room. I don't know, I answered, but I don't think you have coyotes. I don't think the woman who had lived there before me had a sister, and I don't think your cousin had a twin. Everybody dies at some point, and with that reality comes some cold, hard facts. You will have a last kiss, a last hug, a last phone call, and a last photograph. On Friday night, we met up at Casey's house. Even though she is an annoying neighbor, her parents built this amazing fire pit that's the perfect spot for chilly autumn nights. After starting the fire and roasting some marshmallows, she brought out something I hadn't seen in at least a decade, a disposable camera. This is a special camera, Casey said, with a grin. Apparently, when you take a picture, it'll be your last photo before you die. I sat there trying to digest what she was saying. You mean the camera kills you? Yeah, like that one Goosebumps book, Brady replied. Say cheese and die. Oh my gosh, I love that one, Maribel said, grinning. No, that's not what I mean. Casey held her hands up, clearly annoyed that we didn't get it. Everyone has a last photo before they die. Like, for example, my grandpa. 3 days before he passed away, he went on a fishing trip. The last photo on that trip is the last photo that was ever taken of him. Well, it's impossible for a camera to show that, I replied. It would have to be a time-traveling camera for that to work. You guys are no fun, Casey rolled her eyes and started putting the camera back in her bag. Wait, we didn't say we didn't want to use it, Maribel said. Yeah, it could be fun, I added. A wicked smile flashed on Casey's lips. Okay, good. Who wants to be first? Brady raised his hand. I'll go. That was Brady for you. Never missed a chance to impress the girls. He stood up, his face lit by the roaring fire. Where should I stand? The lighting's kinda harsh, maybe by that tree? Brady walked several feet away from the fire and stood next to the tree. Then he leaned against it, crossed his arms and raised an eyebrow. Casey raised the camera to her face. 3, 2, 1, cheese. White light flashed across the dark backyard. Brady stepped away from the tree, grinning. Okay, who's next? Casey asked. I'll go, Maribel said. She pushed her glasses up her nose and stood next to the tree, somewhat awkwardly. Casey lifted the camera to her face again and took a photo. The ratcheting sound of her rewinding the film filled the air. Okay, Benny, your turn, she said, shooting me a smile. I walked over to the tree, took off my baseball cap, and waited. Casey lifted the camera to her face and then frowned. Can't you smile? Nope. Ugh, fine. She rewound the film and handed the camera to me. Then she posed next to the tree in a classic sorority squat pose. Yeah, this wasn't awkward at all. Casey and I had just started dating, but the longer things went on, the more doubts I was having. Sure, we looked good in pictures, a classic football star cheerleader match. In reality, we weren't either of those things. She was pretty, but extremely insecure, jealous, and high maintenance. I was a neurodivergent math nerd who just happened to luck out genetically and look like a jock. I stared at her through the viewfinder, her form slightly distorted. Hey, you didn't count down, she whined. What, you were posing? I want to know exactly when the photo is being taken, that's all. Okay, sure. I rewound the camera and handed it back to her. She sidled up next to me and lowered her voice. Hey, when Brady and Maribel leave, you want to stay a little bit after? Oh, I don't know. My dad's renovating the kitchen, and he wants me to help him in the morning. It doesn't have to be long, just for a little while. I should have said no, but she was pushing, and I felt bad saying no. Okay, just for half an hour. Sounds good to me. We can watch something down in the basement. My parents can't hear a thing down there. What about your neighbor? He seemed really mad when we were watching V for Vendetta. Said the explosions woke him up. Remember, he was pounding on the glass door and yelling at us? She rolled her eyes. So we'll keep the volume down. Come on, it's just half an hour. We don't even have to watch anything. Okay. Before I could say more, she grabbed the camera and started towards the fire pit. I followed. When are you gonna get these developed? Brady asked. We could go tonight. There's still a 1-hour photo in the CVS on Route 14th, Maribel replied. And we can pick up some snacks. Wait, seriously? They still develop photos? Casey asked. My dad uses them for passport photos and other official stuff. So it was decided. The 4 of us piled into Brady's car and took off into the night. We spent the entire hour hanging out at the store, picking out snacks. Then Casey went up to the counter, grabbed the paper envelope, and led us back out to the car. We piled inside and Brady turned on the lights. She flicked open the envelope and pulled out the photos. No fucking way. The first photo showed an older man standing on a beach, gray hair dripping wet, blue waves rolling behind him, but with his square jaw and tall build, he looked like an aged-up Brady. That's impossible, I said. Not necessarily, Maribel replied after a pause. The camera looked like a disposable camera, but it's possible someone put a cheap microchip in there, like a mini Raspberry Pi or something. Then it took our photos and with the help of AI aged them up. Yeah, but how would the CVS develop them, I asked. Maybe it was straightforward. Maybe when he opened the camera to get the film, there was a USB stick there instead, loaded up the images. So he just stuck it in the computer and printed them out. It's weird, but Amazon is full of weird shit like this. I once saw a karaoke machine that used AI to auto-tune everyone as they were singing in real time. Could go back inside and ask them, I suggested. I want to see the rest of the photos first, Casey said, nearly cutting me off. "Where'd you get this camera again?" Maribel asked. "A friend gave it to me," and with that vague response, she flipped on to the next photo. It was a family Christmas photo, several people standing in front of the tree, happy faces lit by multicolored lights. But my heart dropped when I saw the woman on the left. A woman, maybe 30, holding a little baby, with the same heart-shaped face, the same dark curly hair as Maribel. "Oh no," she said, her eyes wide. We all stared at the photo, silently, unsure of what to say. But then I saw it. In the middle of the photo, sitting on the couch, was an old woman, a very old woman, with skin so wrinkled it looked like crepe paper, and hair so white it looked like a tuft of cotton candy on her head. Wire-framed glasses were perched on her nose. "I think that's you." Maribel snatched the photo out of Casey's hands. "Whoa," she whispered, studying it up close. For all her big talk about being some AI thing, she seemed to take it pretty seriously. As I watched Maribel, I couldn't help but smile. For a second, I felt something, a sense of awe as I looked at her face, lighting up with the joy of her family. I've never looked at Maribel as anything other than a friend, but there was something tugging at my heartstrings now. Not even something I could put into words as a crush, or attraction, or lust. Just something. A flicker of connection, of emotion, of... Benny? I glanced at Casey, and then I looked down. In her hands was the photo she'd taken of me. The exact same photo of me, tonight, holding my baseball cap, standing next to the tree, not smiling, staring straight ahead, eyes red from the flash. My first thought was the camera had malfunctioned, whatever this was, AI or otherwise, had messed up and glitched on my picture, and it just spit out the photo as it was taken tonight. But as Casey, Brady, and Maribel stared at me with horror, I realized. So it's saying the picture you took of me tonight is the last picture of me alive. "I guess so," Casey said. The silence pressed in. I shook my head and forced a laugh. "Come on, this is just some stupid prank camera. Like Maribel said, it's some AI thing. Maybe it even purposely skipped some people to scare them." None of them were laughing. "Okay, come on, let's look at Casey's." I plucked my photo from the stack and froze. Casey was sitting on the floor of someone's basement. Her hands were tied to a metal support pole with a thick rope. A strip of duct tape had been placed over her mouth. The left side of her head was matted with blood, and a thin trail dripped down the side of her face. Her blue eyes were wide with fear, and looking straight at whoever was taking the photo. "This is some sick fucking prank," Brady muttered with a voice low with anger. Casey just sat there, frozen. "Let's go home," Maribel said. "Forget all about this stuff. It's just a prank, like Brady said." But Casey didn't move. She just sat there, the photo shaking in her hands, her blue eyes wide with fear. "What's wrong?" Maribel asked softly. "The basement," she said, finally pointing at the photo. "I recognize it. My dad and I went over there one time when he needed help with the fuse box, and I thought he was annoying, but I never..." "Casey, whose basement is it?" I asked. She looked up at me, her eyes wide. "My neighbor's."